Hey everybody, so in this video I'd like to talk about my rule of expansion combined with the adding reverse strategy for fast piano progress. And I'm going to use some actual examples from River Flows and You from a real student's music. I'm going to talk about adding in reverse in brief, my rule of expansion in brief, some common misconceptions around how to combine them together, and the correct way to combine together the rule of expansion, adding in reverse, the difficulty and challenge around combining even a few seemingly simple layers of strategy, and some larger implications for becoming a stronger strategist in general. And on this channel, I hope to share with you strategies, mindsets, insights, etc., often of my own creation that I hope will help you in your piano playing, hopefully other areas of your life as well. So I'll try to be as brief as I can in terms of explaining adding in reverse, rule of expansion, and I'll have to say a few things about my logical methodology and notation as well. So I think the logical notation is a way to keep track of the work that you've done so far. And the basic premise is that we're purposely forgetting and relearning rapidly so that we can have those sections enter our long-term memory, and they're gradually expanding and getting more complex, and there's larger sections that are being pieced together. Because every time that we forget and relearn them, we are able to make them larger and link together larger coordinations because we have the component elements learned well enough because of the effort of like relearning, the effort of retrieving, using that cognitive effort. So going over to the music now, I will first maybe just talk broadly about adding in reverse. I think briefly I can say that a set in my logical methodology is just any given section plus the following note as well too. So if it's a quarter of a measure, like this far plus the next note, we would normally mark a quarter. Let's say that that's both hands. So usually if it's both hands, we would enclose them in these curly brackets. If it's a single hand, like over here, we can see like a 1 within square brackets. That square brackets refer to a single hand. This would mean right hand alone has played one measure plus the following note. If it's half measure, yes, here's a half measure set marker. This is half a measure plus the following note. This would apply only to the left hand. Here we have quarter measure, like quarter of a measure plus the next note as applied only to the left hand. And this means just that we've done a given section probably to memory, or from memory and to quality, like the best quality that we can muster, just a single time. We don't care about remembering it long term when we indicate this, but we've done it correctly a single time from memory into quality. And then later when we come back through spaced repetition, we will increase the size, like I mentioned, increase the complexity. Okay, so that's like the semi-brief version of that. And I'll talk briefly in terms of adding in reverse. If you search David Chang adding in reverse, I mean, there's other videos on this topic too. But just super briefly, for solving a single, hand, let's say that we want to play one measure plus the following beat or following note or so, we could add quarters of a measure in reverse. So this would be a quarter measure set, quarter of a measure plus the next note. In this case, we do have a grace note. We have this extra little note here, but the main note will play all the way to over here. So let's just say this is the end point. If we do a half measure set, it would be half a measure plus this next note here. If we do 3/4 measure set, we would go all the way through like that. And then finally, we've built all the way back to the beginning. And the reason for adding in reverse is because people will tend to be too biased towards the beginning. So they'll play the beginning right and the ending wrong over and over again until eventually they get it. But unfortunately, the beginning was played right an unnecessary number of times. The ending was played wrong too many times before it was then subsequently right. So adding in reverse will counteract that. So that's our default strategy for solving any set, to make our way back to the beginning. And our default strategy for solving both hands sets is adding in reverse separate and then both for each step. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be quarters. It could be eighths of a measure. It could be half measure sets, which is half a measure plus the following beat. But in this example, we might do right and then left and then both, last quarter measure set, right and then left and then both, last half measure set, right and then left and then both, last 3/4 measure set, and then finally right and then left and then both. And all of these pretty colors was for the sake of solving, which means playing correctly even just once from memory to quality, a one measure both hands set, that 12-step process. And we might alternate cycle through all those different areas. So that is the default strategy to solve, to play correctly even one time, any set. in my methodology, whether it's a 1 or it's a 4 or it's an 8 or it's a fractional set like a half, if it's a single hand or a single part, we would just add in reverse some sort of sections. If it is both hands, we will add in reverse separate them both for each step, whatever sections it is that you like. So that's adding in reverse in a nutshell. Those are the default strategies to solve any of these sets or areas. Now, in terms of my rule of expansion, what this states is that if there are two sets that are next to each other and they're the same size and complexity, like in this case we have two half-measure both-hand sets, because curly brackets indicates both hands, so this would mean half a measure plus the following note. And that's indicated by this. The number inside of the brackets, which are written kind of messily, is the number of measures, and in this case it's just half of a measure inside these curly brackets. Here we have half a measure plus the following beat, half in these curly brackets. So we do have two things of the same size and complexity next to each other. And believe it or not, when we come back to this after some time has passed, so some spacing has happened, we're purposely moving on from it, not caring about whether we remember it long term because we're going to forget it anyway. And when we come back, instead of downgrading it if we don't remember it, let's say we have no memory that we've even played this at all, some people might even reduce this to quarters or quarter measure sets or separate hands, but we don't want to do that. We don't even want to just merely review them. We will try to increase this to one measure set. Now that might seem crazy if you don't even remember the component half measure set elements. Again, a half measure set's half a measure plus the following note, but logically it makes sense because as we construct through adding in reverse to solve or try to solve the one measure set, we will end up reviewing the component elements in the process and create more overlap. And I'll try to show an example of this. So if we carry out that same strategy, right and then left and then both the last quarter, right and then left and then both here, and you might not need to do all of these steps every single time, but this is just for the sake of example, right and then left and then both the last 3 quarters, and then maybe like you're starting to reach the limits of your memory. So I'm going to replace all of these colors broadly with blue, and let's assume that you were carrying out that process. So let's say that you ended up able to play this much with both hands as you were trying to add in reverse, and as you attempted playing from the beginning, whether you split it up separate hands or not, you ended up playing maybe this much. So not only have you ended up reviewing the half measure sets that comprise the one that you're trying to solve, but you've also created more points of overlap, particularly over here. And so you've achieved the result that you wanted originally anyway. You hadn't remembered the half measure sets, so you ended up reviewing them, but also you have created more overlap in the middle. And so in this case, even if you ended up failing, you could write a 1 and a capital A for attempted in this case. So basically there's no downside to trying to increase and double the size and increase the next order of complexity. And if you were successful, then you would write a 1. And it didn't matter you didn't remember the component elements, you were still able to construct a 1. So either you're unsuccessful, you write a capital A for attempted, or you would erase these, and if you're successful, you'd write a 1. So this brings me to how is it that people might go about this incorrectly. And I think what happens a lot of the time is that people broadly remember adding in reverse, and they broadly remember rule of expansion, which is just this idea, oh, there's two things that are the same size and complexity next to each other, so the next time I'm going to try to increase to the next size. But they don't quite remember that you're still supposed to add in reverse, either in general or separate and then both for each step when you come back and want to because basically you're expanding these two halves, you're combining them together into a 1. And so to solve this one measure set, you want to add in reverse both hands, or you want to add in reverse separate then both for each step, like I was explaining. The fact that you already solved those two half measure sets, like I'll show you again, like the fact that you solved this half measure set and you played it from memory to quality from there to there, and you did this half measure set from here to here, that still doesn't change the fact that when you want to solve the 1, you still want to add in reverse through the whole measure in order to piece it together. It doesn't change the fact that you might want to do separate them both, last quarter, last half, last 3 quarters, and the entire thing. Or maybe if you're more advanced, you can just do both, add in reverse to solve the 1. What happens a lot of the time instead is that the student will use some other strategy some strategy that I don't recommend. So for example, they may come back, they've solved half measure sets. Hopefully they solved them well in the first place, like they did them intelligently. And then they're like, oh, I remember with rule of expansion, I should increase to a 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. I'm going to review this half measure set first. And then I'm going to now play this half measure set both hands. Okay, so I've reviewed them, and now I'm going to try to play both hands like from the beginning through to the end. That is not my recommended strategy, because you'll still fall victim to the same trap of whether you're playing half of a measure or the entire thing, you'll probably still play the beginning right and the ending wrong. Or maybe if you're relatively more beginner intermediate-ish, maybe it would behoove you to do a lot more separate hands practice as you're going through all those things that I just said. And here's another one that many students are guilty of. It may be that they just say like, oh, I'm just going to play right hand alone and then left hand alone, and then I'll play the whole thing. Because I've already done the half measure set components, so surely it can't be damaging to do right hand alone, left hand alone, then the entire thing. I agree with you, as long as you can do that very quickly and efficiently. But what happens a lot of the time is that the person plays right hand alone all the way through, left hand alone all the way through, and then they'll try playing both hands right after they've done that, and then they still end up doing the same. They still end up playing the beginning right and the ending incorrectly, and then the beginning right and then the ending incorrectly, and then we'll do this over and over and over and over again until after the 25th time they finally get it. So I don't recommend doing this. Even though you solved these half measure sets already, you have this notation here, you did it great into quality. Now that you're trying to use rule of expansion and expanding it to the ones, you want to combine these into a 1. Remember, always, or not always, but a lot of the time, the default strategy, or almost always the default strategy, is going to be adding in reverse. And unless you're fairly experienced, it's probably going to be adding in reverse separate than both for each step. And so if you want to do separate hands, do that in the context of adding in reverse as well too. So let's say you know this quite well. Well, probably the entire measure is still not, like, unless you can get it really quickly. Maybe you want to do the last half right and then left and then both, and then you want to do the entire one measure set right and then left and then both. That could be your solve. But don't get confused. Do not use some different strategy. So adding in reverse, whether adding reverse outright or adding reverse separate and then both for each step, it still remains the default strategy for solving all sets. In all situations, that is our default. If you're more advanced, it could be that you don't need to do as much separate hands. But then I'll need to do separate hands still if it's for like highly technical reasons, or it's like a very fast or difficult passage for me. So notice that there's a tendency to change the entire strategy when we've combined it with the rule of expansion. So it's like we've done the half measure sets already, and so then when we try to do the ones, like we have 2 component half measure set segments, now we're trying to do the 1, and now the student's like, okay, instead of adding in reverse quarter measure sets separate than both for each step, now my strategy is going to be right and then left and then both the entire measure. Or it's going to be, let's do the first half measure set, then the second half measure set, and then hope for the best, or some other variation of these things. And it's just not going to be as effective on average compared to what I just said, which is still just doing the same adding and reverse process as usual. Now, the great counter argument would be if you can show the results. So if you can do whatever you want as long as you very quickly, efficiently get the results and you have awareness of what's going on too. Because the other huge benefit of the explanation I just gave is if you add, let's say, quarters of a measure in reverse separate than both for each step, or maybe more than that if you're more advanced, then that forces you to pay attention to each little component element. So it could be that you get the result in the end, but you're still not as aware of each part. If you do more mental practice, you can also be more aware of each part. So there's multiple reasons why both physically and mentally it's beneficial to walk through these steps. But a lot of the time it's not even about this like line here that we're like, it's like, is the student getting it fast just physically, or are they getting it fast physically and they also have awareness? No, the problem is usually it's still slow because they're using some totally different strategy compared to adding in reverse, when they're using rule of expansion. So So those were some common misconceptions that I just illustrated, and then I also explained the correct way, which is just to continue adding in reverse as usual, separate them both for each step, those little segments. And so this shows, like I mentioned earlier in the video, the difficulty and challenge around combining even a few seemingly simple layers of strategy. The fact that you had those component half measure sets, it still hasn't changed the adding in reverse, separate them both for each step concept for solving all sets. So let's say that I ended up solving that one, I ended up solving another one that's next to it. If I want to combine those two measures together into a two-measure set, I'm still not going to fall victim to the same traps I just set. I'm not going to, do a two-measure set right hand alone, a two-measure set left hand alone, and then I'm not going to do the first measure alone and then the second measure alone. I'm just going to add in reverse, separate them both for each step from the end of that two-measure set. And you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and illustrate that, even though this video is already a little bit long. Just for clarity's sake, just the teacher and me, I just feel like it's a good idea. So let's pretend we solved these one measure sets and we did them using all those things, all those steps I just said, separate them both for each step. So we were pretty smart about it. Now, if I want to solve this too, I will not play right hand alone and then left hand alone and then the whole thing. I will not do, the first measure review and then the second one review and then I'm just going to add in reverse, separate them both for each step. So I'm going to do, let's say, last half measure set right and then left and then both. Sorry, that was a little bit messy. Then I'll do right and then left and then both. This last one measure set. Maybe this is really hard for me. So I'm going to do the last 1 1/4 measure set right and then left and then both. And then I'll do the last 1 1/2 measure set right and then left and then both. And then maybe I can just skip and do the entire 2 measure set right and then left and then both. And then with this, I will be able to then erase these little 1 measure set markers and write a 2. And maybe I have to go through all those pretty colors again. And I'll have to alternate between all those different steps multiple times, or I'll have to add in some different way. But that is still my default strategy. The fact that there were ones here, it did not change my overall strategy for solving sets. So I hope that those examples made sense. In terms of larger implications for becoming a strong strategist, it's really important to maintain the integrity of each of the component layers. So I talk a lot about layering on the channel. I have that 14 layers of strategy series. So let's say that in addition to this, I started doing metronome cycling. You can search David Chang metronome cycling. Or I started writing the complete planning of musical detail. You can search David Chang complete planning of musical detail, writing the complete fingering. I started doing lightning fast altered rhythms. I started using 3-dimensionality and movement, or I don't know, all of these different layers. It still has not changed the fundamental integrity of the adding in reverse principle, adding in reverse, separate them both for each step, for instance. So I think it's important to keep each of those individual layers crystal clear so they're each just as effective as when they were used on their own. And this way, when we have every layer operating at optimum capacity, each one serving as an independent multiplier, you truly will receive the greatest, most efficient results possible because you're getting the maximum efficacy and efficiency out of each individual concept. And in this case, really, we were just broadly talking about adding in reverse and rule of expansion, although obviously we also talked about logical notation and space repetition and all of that sort of thing. So hopefully this is helpful. Let me know if you have follow-up questions. And if you did find this helpful, then please subscribe, let people know about the channel. And as usual, looking forward to the next video.